When Jasmine Crockett took the stage beside Ilhan Omar, no one expected what would follow. One tear, 6 words, and 14 million views later, the silence that haunted generations was broken. On a talk show titled What They Never Told You About Power, Jasmine shared a story from one Texas night that no politician had dared to speak. Ilhan, scarred by years of betrayal, broke down, not from weakness, but because someone finally voiced what she'd buried for a decade. So what exactly did Jasmine say that made the world stop and brought Ilhan Omar to tears? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The cameras hadn't started rolling yet, but the tension in Studio 9 was already humming beneath the soft jazz music playing overhead. The set of unfiltered voices was deliberately understated. Velvet armchairs in deep indigo, a table of hand-poured tea between them, and warm amber lights glowing like a sunset frozen in time. But the mood wasn't warm. Not tonight. This wasn't a night for comfort. It was a night for truth with no apology. On one side sat Ilhan Omar, spine straight, fingers locked, eyes alert beneath lashes trained by years of political warfare. On the other sat Jasmine Crockett, posture relaxed but aura electric, like a thunderstorm pretending to be calm. The producers knew this wasn't just any episode. It was the first time these two firebrands would share the same frame, and the subject? What They Never Told You About Power, a title that promised blood, if not tears. As the director counted down, 5, 4, 3, there was a beat, almost imperceptible, where everything stood still. Then the lights snapped hotter, the music faded, and the host, Vanessa Hill, leaned forward with a voice too smooth for the storm she was about to unleash. Let's talk about what power costs you when you look like them. Her hand gestured, not gently, to Ilhan and Jasmine. The studio audience, a rare mix of students, activists, and reporters, leaned in as if holding their breath. Ilhan's face didn't move, but her jaw tightened. Jasmine cocked her head slightly, as if preparing for war with a smile. No teleprompter could save them tonight. This wasn't about policy points or polling numbers. This was about what had been stolen and what they dared to take back. And as the first question sliced through the air, the real show began. Not of politics, but of survival. And just as the tension from Jasmine's story began to settle into silence, the host pivoted, her voice low, deliberate, almost reverent. Congresswoman Omar, may I ask, when the world turns your words against you, what does survival look like? The lights seemed to dim, not physically, but emotionally, as if the room itself braced for what was coming. Ilhan didn't answer right away. She inhaled slowly, eyes locked on the floor for a brief second, not in shame, but in memory. When she finally spoke, it was with the precise control of someone who has had to weaponize their own voice just to be heard. It was a Thursday, she began, a regular meeting, a town hall. I was speaking about the dangers of isolation, how extremism festers where people feel invisible, unheard. I referenced a question someone had asked me. I repeated it. Some terrorist groups claim to have legitimate grievances, and then I refuted it. Right there. Strongly, unequivocally. Her voice did not waver. But someone decided to slice that moment, cut out the context, rip out the rejection. All that remained was the infection. My voice, saying words I never believed. She blinked once, slowly, as if reliving the moment the clip went viral. And within hours, I wasn't a representative anymore. I was a threat, a target, a caricature. People I'd worked beside for years didn't call, didn't ask. They forwarded statements to press secretaries and vanished into silence. Her jaw tightened. Her hands were still, but her presence was thunder. They didn't just smear me, she continued. They unstitched my citizenship, thread by thread, as if the oath I took meant less because of my scarf, or my accent, or my skin. She turned her head slightly, locking eyes with no one, and yet everyone. The death threats weren't the worst part. The worst part was walking into chambers with people who knew me, who knew better, and watching them pretend neutrality was courage. Then came the line that held the room hostage. I wasn't abandoned by enemies. I was abandoned by silence. She didn't cry. She didn't need to. Her pain wasn't in her tears. It was in her restraint, in the way her voice stayed level, even as her truth flayed the air open. This wasn't just recollection. It was revelation. She wasn't recounting an event. She was indicting a system. And in that breathless studio, under the illusion of calm amber lights, Ilhan Omar did not ask for pity. She asked for reckoning. And as Ilhan's words dissolved into the charged stillness, not a single soul in the room dared to move. It was the kind of silence that didn't ask for respect. It commanded it. The camera, almost reluctantly, shifted its gaze to Jasmine Crockett. No words, no gestures, just a slow pan to a woman sitting not across from Ilhan, but beside her in spirit. Jasmine didn't speak, didn't lean forward for dramatic effect. She simply looked. And in that look was fire without flames, grief without tears, rage without noise. Her eyes were unflinching, locked on Ilhan not like a politician watching a peer, but like a soldier watching another survivor recount the ambush. Her lips didn't tremble, her face didn't soften, but something in her shifted, subtly, visibly, like steel flexing under heat. And then came the nod. Not a courteous tilt, not a diplomatic cue for applause. This was a silent oath, sealed in the space between breath and bone. A nod that said, "I've been betrayed too. I know what silence tastes like, and I didn't come here to perform. I came to stand." The moment that followed wasn't filled with commentary or filler. It was thick with something deeper, heavier. The atmosphere between them was not confrontational, nor sympathetic. It was compressed, tense, but sacred, like two tectonic plates meeting beneath the surface, unspoken histories grinding into alignment. Jasmine's posture remained unchanged, but her presence expanded, claiming space not with volume, but with truth unspoken. You could almost feel the vibration in the floorboards, as if the very studio recognized that what was happening was no longer television. This was something raw, older, a silent reckoning between two women who had learned, through wounds and whispers, that being heard was a privilege they had to carve out of stone. Jasmine didn't break the silence with words. She broke it with witness. And in that quiet rupture, Ilhan wasn't alone anymore. There were no lights bright enough to capture what passed between them, but every woman who'd ever been gaslit, sidelined, or erased felt it. And just when the studio seemed to hold its final breath, when the memory between two women had finished echoing through the silence, Vanessa leaned in once more, this time with eyes sharp and tone almost reverent. "Congresswoman Crockett," she said, her voice low like the turning of a key, "have you ever stood alone?" Jasmine didn't answer right away. She didn't blink. Her expression shifted, barely. But for those who knew the language of trauma, it was unmistakable. It was the kind of stillness that comes before thunder. She turned slightly toward the audience, but not for show. She turned because what she was about to say couldn't be spoken straight into the air. It had to be spoken through it. "It was a night in July," she began, voice steady, quiet, not soft. "Summer in Texas is thick, the kind of heat that crawls under your collar and makes your skin feel like it's trying to escape your body. I remember because I had just finished court, a late arraignment, a juvenile case that didn't sit right with me. My phone buzzed while I was halfway to the parking lot. It was a mother, shaking so hard on the call I could barely understand her. Her son, 17, black, soft-spoken, barely 5'7", had just been tackled outside a corner store. No gun, no stolen goods. Just a hoodie, a backpack, and skin the color police protocols were built to fear. She inhaled slowly, eyes unfocused now, not lost, but accessing something exact. "They said he fit a description, that's all. No details, no victim, no report. Just a body on the sidewalk in handcuffs that clicked like a sentence already written." Jasmine's jaw set. "I drove straight to the station, still in my heels, still in my suit. I asked to see him. They told me no. I asked again, showed my badge, my license, cited the code. They laughed. 'You're not his lawyer of record,' they said. 'You can wait outside.' Her eyes lifted now, straight into the lens, unflinching. So I did. I waited 6 hours in the thick heat, alone. I stood under the street lamp, phone in one hand, live stream on in the other. No ring light, no script, just me, a sidewalk, and a voice I refused to mute. I narrated everything, every officer who walked in, every hour they refused to provide paperwork, every lie they tried to wrap in bureaucratic language. The video caught fire. People started sharing, watching, commenting, and still, no one came. No attorney, no activist, no elected official, just me and a boy behind a wall. She leaned forward slightly, the weight in her voice sharpening like the draw of a blade. Around hour 4, my inbox filled with warnings, friends telling me I was making the department angry, colleagues texting me things like, "This isn't smart, and you're risking your career." Then came the calls, blocked numbers, distorted voices. "You don't want to make enemies, Ms. Crockett. You sure you want to be the face of this?" As if I had chosen it, as if silence was ever a real option. She paused and the room sat still, breathless. At hour 5, a car rolled up slow behind me, tinted windows, engine idling like it had something to say. It didn't stop, just circled, twice. I remember gripping my phone tighter, not out of fear, but out of fury, because I realized in that moment, if anything happened to me, there would be no arrest, no footage, no headlines, just another headline that never made it. Her voice dipped, lower, heavier, but never trembling. Then in hour 6, a local reporter showed up. She had seen the stream. She brought a cameraman. Within minutes, a supervisor inside the station came out, suddenly very polite. "There's been a clerical error," he said. "He's being released." Just like that. No explanation, no apology, no accountability. That boy walked out with his shoelaces still missing and eyes so wide it looked like he hadn't blinked in hours. She didn't smile. She didn't flinch. That night didn't make me brave. It made me angry because the system didn't fail. It worked exactly as it was built. It took 6 hours, 2,000 viewers, and a goddamn news camera to release a child who hadn't done a thing wrong. That's not justice. That's public relations under duress. She looked directly at Vanessa now. And yes, I paid a price. The next morning, I got called into the office. I was told my actions were unprofessional, that I had embarrassed the district. I was warned. I was threatened. One senior attorney even told me, "You'll never make it in this game with stunts like that." And I remember looking at him and thinking, if this is the game, I don't want to play. I want to break the damn board. A hush swept the studio, not emptiness, but reverence. Jasmine sat back finally and folded her hands. Not as surrender, but as punctuation. "That night wasn't the first time I saw injustice," she said, voice low now, almost intimate. "But it was the first time I realized I couldn't keep patching the wounds. I had to fight the knife." She let the words hang there, heavy, real, undeniable. And in that moment, under lights that no longer felt stage, on a stage that had become sacred, Jasmine Crockett wasn't a politician. She wasn't a guest. She was a reckoning made flesh. And every person watching knew. The line between witness and warrior is one step, and she had taken it, alone, unflinching, and uninvited. And when Jasmine's final words about that long night in Dallas began to dissipate into the breathless stillness of the studio, Vanessa leaned in once more. This time, not as a host, but as a human being reaching through the fog of memory. Her voice was quieter now, almost fragile in the wake of what had just been shared, as if it too were treading carefully across the ashes of something sacred. "But were you afraid?" The question cut cleanly, not because it was harsh, but because it was true. It wasn't scripted. It wasn't rhetorical. It was raw. For a full 3 seconds, Jasmine didn't respond. Her face didn't shift. Her body didn't flinch. But something in her eyes, something deep, coiled, forged, tightened. She didn't blink, didn't perform. She just sat in the weight of the question like a woman who had carried it before. And then, In a tone so steady it felt carved from the very moment she was about to recall, she answered, "Of course I was afraid," she said. The words weren't defensive. They weren't even brave. They were undeniable. You don't stand in front of a police station at midnight knowing damn well that you're being watched by men with badges and power and permission and not feel fear. Her voice didn't rise. It sank, slow and deliberate, like a confession pulled from the bottom of a well. The air was thick with it. Fear in every breath. Fear in the way I turned my back to the parking lot. Fear in the headlights that didn't turn off even when the engine did. She drew in a slow breath, not for drama, but like someone remembering how her lungs worked in the moment she almost forgot. It wasn't the kind of fear that makes you run. It was the kind that roots you in place and dares you to move anyway. My phone felt like a weapon. Every word I said into that live stream, I said wondering if it would be the last thing people heard from me. But I kept going. Not because I wasn't scared, but because I was terrified of what would happen if I didn't. Now she leaned forward, hands clasped between her knees, not to ground herself, but to anchor the truth about to follow. If I didn't stand there, if I didn't shine a light on that door and force the world to see it, then what would have happened to that boy? Her voice cracked, not with emotion, but with the pressure of holding too much clarity inside too long. He would have disappeared, not legally, not with fanfare, just gone, buried in paperwork, mislabeled as dangerous, reduced to a mugshot and a lie. And I would have known, I would have carried it, that I let silence finish what injustice started. She looked up now, eyes burning, not with tears, but with precision. "So yeah," she said again, more softly, more deadly. "I was afraid, but silence kills more than fear ever will. And if I didn't stand there that night, then someone else, some kid, some mother's son, would have been devoured by the same machine that almost took him. They would have vanished, and I would have watched it happen, from the safety of my own career. And that," she exhaled sharply, "that is not safety. That is complicity in a nicer suit." The audience didn't move. Even the camera operators seemed to have stopped breathing. Jasmine's next words came with the weight of someone who wasn't just answering a question, but confronting a system that punished truth and rewarded silence. "That night taught me something I can't unlearn," she said. "Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's what you do with your fear when no one's watching, when the headlines haven't started and the cameras haven't come, and it's just you and the sound of your own heartbeat and a door that won't open." She paused again, not to compose herself, but to let the silence digest her truth. "I stood there because I couldn't live with myself if I didn't, and I haven't regretted that night for a single second. But what still haunts me, what I still carry, is that I was alone." Her fingers curled into her palms, not shaking, but locked in quiet fury. "And the fact that standing up against injustice requires risking everything you've earned says everything about the kind of country we're still living in." And then came the final blow. Not a shout, not a chant, but a single sentence delivered with such quiet precision it felt like a scalpel slicing open the very walls of the studio. "If I didn't stand there, who would be next to be swallowed whole by silence?" There was no response, no reaction, just stunned stillness. But in that stillness, something irreversible happened. And as Jasmine's final sentence echoed across the studio like a slow blade slicing through silence, "If I didn't stand there, who would be next to be swallowed whole by silence?" The room felt as if it had been carved open. Not a whisper stirred. Not even the soft hum of the studio lights could cut through the stillness now. The audience didn't breathe. The cameras kept rolling, but even the lenses seemed to pause, uncertain whether what was unfolding still belonged on a screen or had crossed into something more sacred. Ilhan Omar sat motionless. Her posture hadn't changed since the start of the show. Poised, disciplined, balanced like a sculpture sculpted from resolve. But now there was something unsteady, barely visible, but undeniable. Her hands remained folded in her lap, but her eyes were no longer locked on the host or the crowd. They were fixed on Jasmine, not just looking, but seeing. Something inside her cracked, not loudly, not violently, but like a splinter deep in the foundation of something long thought unshakable. She turned her face slightly, not enough to escape the camera, but enough to make clear that something inside had shifted. Her gaze dropped, not in shame, but in revelation. And then it happened. The kind of moment no script can write and no audience can prepare for. A tear, not many, not dramatic, just one. A single silvered thread slipping down the edge of her cheek. She didn't wipe it away right away. She let it fall. She let it exist. Not as surrender, but as testimony. When she finally spoke, her voice was a whisper, not because it was weak, but because it was real. As if anything louder would break the moment's fragile truth. "No one has ever said it like that," she murmured. Her eyes didn't move from Jasmine's. "Not like you just did." And in those few words, the air shifted again. Not with applause, not with commentary, but with a kind of silent, collective exhale. The audience hadn't expected Ilhan Omar, the unshakable, unflinching, always strategic congresswoman, to break. And yet here she was, not broken, but opened, reclaimed. She paused, letting the silence stretch, not for effect, but for space. "I've carried so much, for so long," she said finally, the words dragging up from somewhere deep and guarded. Not just the attacks, not just the headlines, but the silence. The awful, cavernous silence that came after. The silence from people who knew the truth but said nothing. People who watched me get torn apart piece by piece and chose comfort over courage. Her voice didn't tremble, but it carried weight, thick as grief, sharp as memory. And in the middle of all that, I trained myself to survive by hardening, by burying things too fragile to protect. She finally reached up and wiped her cheek. Not quickly, not dismissively. The gesture was slow, deliberate, as if reclaiming even that act, the right to weep without apology. "Somewhere along the way," she continued, "I convinced myself that fear had no place in what I do, that to survive this work, I had to strip it away, hide it so deep even I forgot it was there. Because if I showed it, if I so much as let it flicker in my voice, they'd seize it, they'd twist it into proof. Proof that I didn't belong. Proof that I was too emotional, too volatile, too fragile for rooms built to contain power that was never designed for women like me. The truth of it, too long buried, now hung in the air, unmovable. I wrapped myself in armor made of rage," she confessed. "It was clean. It was sharp. It didn't beg. It didn't tremble. It let me survive debates where people questioned my loyalty to the country I risked everything to serve. It let me stand in hearings where my faith was mocked and my humanity dissected. But rage doesn't hold you when the cameras turn off. Rage doesn't help you sleep when the threats keep coming. Rage can't carry you when silence eats at your soul." Her voice dropped again, barely audible, but every syllable landed like a heartbeat amplified under a stethoscope. "You reminded me tonight," she said, eyes still locked with Jasmine's, "that fear is not failure. Fear is evidence that we still care, that we still feel, that we haven't let them hollow us out completely." She took another breath, sharp, ragged, necessary. "I forgot that. I forgot that fear is not something to erase. It's something to stand on. And you didn't just say it. You embodied it. You stood in it. You let it live. And in doing so, you gave it back to the rest of us." And in that moment, Ilhan Omar, warrior, target, symbol, was no longer speaking for the cameras, the headlines, or even the audience. She was speaking to one woman across one moment as one survivor to another. And for the first time in years, the weight she carried didn't feel like a sentence. It felt like something she could finally begin to share. Not in shame, not in secrecy, but in solidarity. A single tear, a single sentence, and a silence that didn't erase, but healed. That was all it took, and that was everything. And as the final echoes of Ilhan's voice faded into the stillness, as if the very walls of the studio needed a moment to breathe, the host gave a soft nod to the control booth. The wrap signal came down. The cameras cut. The lights dimmed. Applause, muted, stunned, reverent, swept through the audience, but even that felt distant, like noise from another world. One by one, spectators filed out in silence, their expressions carved with something heavier than admiration. No music played them out. No stagehand rushed in with pleasantries. Just a slow, respectful quiet. And in the center of it all, beneath the fading glow of forgotten spotlights, Ilhan and Jasmine remained seated. Neither woman moved. Neither woman stood. Not yet. The studio was nearly empty now. No producers buzzing around, no cameras tracking their every breath. The illusion was stripped away. No teleprompters, no cue cards, no soft-focus lenses to catch tears just right. What remained were two women of color, alone in a room that had just held the weight of their truths, and now echoed with everything left unsaid. Ilhan sat with her hands loosely clasped, still staring at the table as if trying to steady the emotional tremors that followed everything she had just opened up. Jasmine, beside her, leaned back, not in relief, but in stillness. They didn't speak immediately. They didn't need to. What had passed between them didn't require translation. It wasn't politics anymore. It was memory. It was scar tissue. It was recognition. Then, without a word, Jasmine reached into her purse. Her movements were slow, intentional, like someone retrieving something sacred, not just stored, but guarded. From a leather sleeve tucked deep inside, she pulled out a small, worn piece of paper, its edges frayed, the ink faded into the color of time. She unfolded it carefully, as if afraid the decades might crumble it in her hands. The gesture caught Ilhan's eye. Her head turned just slightly. No curiosity, just quiet attention. Jasmine placed the paper between them. Her voice when she finally spoke wasn't public. It wasn't performative. It was the voice of someone peeling back a layer they hadn't touched in years. "My mother wrote this to me," she said, "the night before I argued my first case in front of a judge who wouldn't look me in the eye." Her fingers hovered above the words, not pointing, but remembering. "She died 2 weeks later. I kept this ever since." Ilhan leaned in, not out of etiquette, but because something told her this wasn't just a note. It was a survival weapon passed down. And there it was, 7 words written in slanted cursive, worn but still defiant. "Speak when your voice shakes. That's when it matters most." Ilhan read it again, then again, and with each pass, something behind her ribs seemed to shift. Something long buried beneath armor and headlines and assassination threats. She didn't speak. She just nodded. Once. A nod that held 30 years of exile, resistance, press briefings, and quiet tears swallowed behind closed office doors. A nod that said, "That's the truth no one puts in books." Jasmine let the silence sit. She didn't explain it. She didn't interpret it. She just let it live. Between them, beside them, inside them. A relic of another woman's fire, now passed from trembling hand to trembling heart. And in that quiet, with no audience left to impress, the stage became a confessional. And the confessional became a bond. Not of party or platform or purpose, but of something harder to name. Shared resistance through uninvited womanhood. They didn't speak again for a while. They didn't need to, because in that moment, they weren't just public figures. They were daughters of women who were never allowed to scream, now daring to speak even when their voices shook. And that was the legacy they would carry, not in press releases or podiums, but in the kind of silence that finally had a voice. And for a long time after the paper was placed between them, neither woman said a word. The stage lights had long since cooled. The clatter of cleanup in the wings faded into a hollow hum. Even the studio's hollow echo seemed to soften itself out of respect for what remained. No more questions, no more declarations. The war of words was over. All that remained now was the quiet aftermath of 2 women sitting in the ruins of things unspoken. No longer shielded by the armor of performance, no longer hidden behind roles or reputations. Just them, and history, and breath. It was Jasmine who moved first, not abruptly, not even deliberately. Her hands simply reached out, slow and open, across the space that just hours ago had been filled with tension, lights, and the burden of 1,000 unspoken expectations. Her fingers curled gently around Ilhan's, not with urgency, not for show, but with the kind of weight that says, "I see you, and I am still here." No words accompanied the gesture, no fanfare, no applause, just the press of skin against skin, a grip forged not in agreement but in endurance. Ilhan didn't pull away. In fact, she leaned into it, just slightly, just enough to close the last inch between solidarity and something far more sacred. Recognition without condition. Her thumb moved ever so slightly along Jasmine's knuckle, a barely there motion, more instinct than choice, but one that said everything words would only dilute. And then, after an hour of composure, control, and measured confession, Ilhan Omar smiled. It wasn't wide, it wasn't bright, but it was real. The kind of smile that belongs only to people who have survived being misunderstood for so long. They'd almost forgotten what it felt like to be heard. Her shoulders lowered by a centimeter, the invisible armor around her spine loosening for the first time all night. Her gaze lifted, not toward the door, not toward the cameras, but straight into Jasmine's eyes. "You just reminded me," Ilhan whispered, voice hoarse, edged with something between awe and exhaustion, "why I came here in the first place." She didn't mean the studio, and Jasmine knew it. She meant the fight. She meant the purpose. She meant every vote, every headline, every death threat, every sleepless night wondering if the country she served would ever see her as anything more than an idea to be dissected. She meant why she had survived. Jasmine didn't answer with words. She just nodded, one slow, grounded motion that felt like the sealing of something timeless. She squeezed Ilhan's hand a little tighter, then released it with the precision of someone who knew the exact weight of vulnerability and when to let it breathe. The room around them was empty now. The stage hands were gone. The floor manager had slipped away hours ago. The only illumination came from the overhead work lights, cold, white, impersonal. But between the two chairs at the center of the stage, something still glowed. Not light, but a residue, a heat, a kind of post-battle warmth that doesn't show up in pictures or reviews, but lives in the muscle memory of people who have survived something true together. They stood, slowly. Neither of them rushed. The moment didn't demand speed, it demanded gravity. Ilhan rose first, smoothing her jacket out of habit, not presentation. Jasmine followed, straightening her back not because anyone was watching, but because standing tall was all she had ever known. There was no music to walk out to, no press line to greet, just the sound of two sets of heels crossing a stage that no longer belonged to television, but to testimony. They didn't speak as they walked. They didn't need to. They weren't walking as politicians now. They weren't walking as guests. They weren't walking as rivals, or allies, or icons. They were walking as co-survivors of a system designed to chew up their silence and spit out their dignity. And for once, they were walking off the battlefield with someone beside them. They reached the studio's rear exit, past the curtain, where the hallway lights hummed with the sterile flicker of after-hours fluorescent. A lone janitor nodded as they passed. Just a small, human nod, but one Jasmine returned with quiet clarity. Ilhan exhaled, the kind of breath that tastes like release, the kind you don't even realize you've been holding until someone else enters the room and gives you permission to let it go. Outside, the city of Washington, D.C. stretched out beneath the night sky like a sleeping titan, its monuments cold with marble memory, its windows glowing with bureaucratic insomnia. A black car waited at the curb, tinted and sleek, its engine murmuring like protocol, but neither woman moved toward it just yet. They stood for another second, two silhouettes cast in amber parking lot light, their shadows long and crossing on the concrete beneath them. And for that one final moment, they weren't public servants. They weren't symbols. They weren't vessels for progress or objects of scorn. They were daughters of fire, molded by injustice, baptized by silence, and remade in each other's reflection. They didn't leave that studio as friends. They left as something rarer, witnesses to each other's fight. Not because they believed the same things, but because they believed in being unafraid together. And as Jasmine stepped toward her car and Ilhan reached for the door handle of hers, they didn't say goodbye. They just looked at each other, nodded once more, and carried the silence with them. Not as burden, but as proof they had finally been seen. And as both women disappeared into the night, each stepping into separate vehicles but carrying the same unshakable silence, the studio lights dimmed for the final time. What they didn't know, what no one knew in that moment, was that the real impact hadn't started yet. The cameras had turned off, yes, but the footage had been captured, archived, filed. And 27 minutes later, the control room intern, eyes still wet from a story he hadn't expected to feel, hit export, then upload. And without a single press release, without a single promotional post from the network's PR team, the revolution began. It started slow. One clip, grainy and raw, posted to a small Twitter account under the caption, "This moment between Jasmine Crockett and Ilhan Omar." It just changed the game. Watch until the end. Then came the cascade. By the 1 hour mark, it had reached 30,000 views. By the second, over 600,000. By dawn, 11.4 million. People weren't just watching. They were pausing, rewinding, screenshotting. The segment where Jasmine described the boy outside the convenience store, her voice steady and low, standing alone with only a live stream as armor, that clip cracked something open. It was shared by activists, teachers, former prosecutors, mothers. Then came the cut to Ilhan, silent, shattered, one tear falling like a blade through generations of silence. That was the moment that broke the dam. A major black media outlet gave the segment a name, Moments That Rewrote Silence. And the phrase took off like fire across dry kindling. By lunchtime, major journalists were dissecting the frame-by-frame shifts in Ilhan's facial expression. Body language experts on TikTok analyzed her pause, the subtle swallow in her throat before she said, "No one has ever said it like that." News anchors stumbled over how to describe it. Not quite a breakdown, not quite a breakthrough. But viewers didn't need the language. They understood what had happened because it had happened to them. What followed wasn't a wave. It was a rupture. Emails began flooding into the network. Thousands. Tens of thousands. Not complaints, not controversy. Letters, handwritten, typed, dictated from hospital beds, prison libraries, late-night break rooms. They came from young women who had never seen themselves protected, only pitied. From middle-aged organizers who had stood on the front lines with no cameras and no coverage. From daughters of immigrants, survivors of silence, women who had spent their lives screaming into rooms that never listened. One message, posted publicly and reshared 4.7 million times, read, "Dear Representative Crockett and Representative Omar, I watched your talk show in the back of a city bus, riding home from my third job. I paused it 5 times because I couldn't stop crying. I've never seen power look like that. I've never seen someone look scared and still stand anyway. That's what you gave me, permission, to shake and still speak." The hashtag #We Shake. We Speak was born within hours. Students started organizing pop-up screenings in college auditoriums, lighting candles afterward in silence. One HBCU professor replaced her entire semester's syllabus with a single instruction. Watch that interview, then write what you've never dared say. A 15-year-old girl from Baltimore posted a video of herself reading Jasmine's mother's quote in front of her school's main hallway. "Speak when your voice shakes. That's when it matters most." The clip was viewed 12 million times in 36 hours. But beyond the numbers, beyond the likes, the shares, the analysis, was something slower, deeper, and more untraceable. Women stopped apologizing. In classrooms, in board meetings, in courtrooms, on stages. Something in the cultural bloodstream had changed. Representation had shifted form. It was no longer a poster. It wasn't just a photo on a voting pamphlet. It was Jasmine standing in heels in the Texas heat. It was Ilhan not flinching when the tears came. It was not performance. It was embodiment. And the word representation started to mean something else. For decades, it had been thrown around like a prize, as if proximity to power was power itself, as if one person in a room was enough to call it inclusive. But now, after that video, after that night, young women began to rewrite the word. Representation wasn't being in the room. It was naming the fire you walk through to get there. It was sitting in the chair and telling the truth even when your voice trembled and your hands wouldn't stop sweating. It was holding your ground in the face of systemic silence and daring to call it by name. An open letter campaign was launched on day 4. Title, You Made Representation an Action. Over 78,000 women signed it in the first 72 hours. Some added stories, others added names. Most just wrote, "Thank you for not flinching when it mattered." Jasmine responded with a single post. "We don't need perfect leaders. We need brave ones. And brave is what happens when you speak, even if the room shakes with you." Ilhan followed with a line that lit the match again. "If I could cry on national TV and still stand, so can you." Prints of that quote began appearing across subway stations in New York, painted onto school walls in Oakland, etched into glass at a domestic violence shelter in Chicago. It wasn't politics anymore. It wasn't trending. It was gospel. Something had been handed down that night, not just from one generation to the next, but from one survivor to another. And in that passing, the silence finally broke. Not with noise, not with slogans, but with truth that refused to ask permission. In one of the most widely shared interviews after the event, a CNN host tried to ask Ilhan, "Were you surprised by the public reaction?" She paused, then gave the smallest of smiles, the kind that doesn't seek validation. "Surprised? Number, I think we always knew the silence was full. We just didn't know the world was finally ready to hear what it had been holding." And somewhere in Dallas, a mother's words, scribbled in ink and carried in a folded note for years, had detonated into something vast and unstoppable. Speak when your voice shakes. That's when it matters most. And now millions of voices were doing just that. And as the noise faded and the headlines began to simmer, the world moved forward, as it always does. Movements evolve, stories shift, and even the most seismic moments are eventually folded into memory. But not for everyone. Not for those who had been cracked open by the broadcast. Not for those who had lived in silence and now recognized their own reflection in the space it left behind. And not for Ilhan Omar. Because for her, it didn't end when the cameras stopped. It didn't end when the hashtags faded or when the press cycle moved on to the next catastrophe. For her, something had been reawakened. Something too deep to name, too personal to share. But it burned inside her all the same. Quiet, relentless, and sacred. So when a small university in the Northeast reached out, asking if she would deliver the keynote speech at their spring commencement, Ilhan didn't hesitate. She didn't send a surrogate. She didn't submit a statement. She wrote the speech herself. The day of the ceremony, the sky was split wide open with light, a canvas of blue so clear it looked unreal. The stage was built in the middle of the quad, a black platform surrounded by folding chairs in tension. Rows of graduates, cloaked in identical robes, shimmered in the sun like waves. But beneath the symmetry were stories. Immigrant daughters, first-generation fighters, women who had clawed their way to the edge of power with bruised hands and sleepless nights. Ilhan saw them, all of them. And as she took the podium, the crowd hushed, not from obligation, but reverence. She stood tall. No notes, no teleprompter. Just a single folded sheet in her pocket, untouched. "When I first stood behind a microphone," she began, "I didn't know if anyone would hear me, or if they'd just wait for me to fail." Her voice was clear, grounded. "And for a long time, I believed I had to sound invincible just to be allowed to speak at all. But I've learned something in these years inside the fire, and I'd like to share it with you now. Not as a politician, not as a guest, but as a woman still learning how to be whole." There was no stirring in the crowd. Even the wind held its breath. "I won't name names," she continued, her eyes scanning the horizon above the students' caps. "But a few months ago, I sat on a stage across from someone who reminded me of something I had forgotten. Something powerful, something terrifying, and something true." She reached into her pocket slowly, carefully, and pulled out the folded paper. A piece so worn its corners were nearly translucent. "She carried this with her for years," Ilhan said, voice thinner now, more fragile. A note from someone she loved, someone she lost. It wasn't meant for me, but it reached me anyway. And now, I want to give it to you. She unfolded the paper and read the words aloud. Her voice didn't tremble. It cracked, but it didn't break. Speak when your voice shakes. That's when it matters most. The words hung in the air like a drumbeat that refused to fade. A few gasps from the crowd, a sob from the back row. But Ilhan didn't look at them. She looked up, straight into the sky. The blue above was endless, stretched like memory, untouched by noise or fear. And for a moment, it looked almost too perfect, like something waiting to be broken. She smiled, the first real smile she had worn since that night, the kind that wasn't for cameras, the kind that came only when truth had finally made its way through the bones. Across the country, in a modest home office lit only by a desk lamp and laptop screen, Jasmine Crockett watched alone. She wasn't scheduled to speak that day. She had turned down 3 interviews, but she had made time for this. Her phone buzzed constantly beside her, texts from colleagues and journalists asking if she was watching. She didn't answer. When Ilhan read the words, her mother's words, something in Jasmine's throat closed. Not just with pride, not just with memory, but with the strange, aching beauty of being known without being named. Ilhan hadn't said her name. She didn't need to, because sometimes the most sacred things are not shouted, but held. And then it happened. Jasmine cried, not like the single tear Ilhan had let fall on national television, but quietly, fully, the kind of cry that comes not from pain, but from release, a kind of holy grief, the recognition that something you carried alone has now become part of the world's language. She pressed her fingers to her lips, as if to keep something sacred inside. Back at the university, Ilhan closed her speech with a whisper, not because her voice had failed, but because she knew they were ready to listen. "So when you leave this place," she said, "I don't want you to be fearless. I want you to tremble and still speak, because your voice, even shaking, can be the thing that keeps someone else from being swallowed by silence." There was no standing ovation, not immediately, because no one wanted to move. No one wanted to interrupt the gravity that had fallen like ash across their robes. But then it started. From the left corner, a slow rise, then another, and another, until every graduate stood, and then the faculty, and then the parents, and then the staff. The quad erupted, not with noise, but with presence. No one shouted. They just stood, like they had just been handed something they never expected to receive. And as Ilhan stepped down from the podium, tucking the note carefully back into her pocket, she knew this wasn't closure. This wasn't the end of anything. It was a return to the reason she came, to the fight she had almost forgotten how to name, to the woman who reminded her that fear is not an enemy, it is a compass, and that shaking doesn't mean you stop. It means you begin. And somewhere in Texas, one woman wept and smiled and whispered the words back into her own hands. That's when it matters most. And as the crowd stood still beneath that open sky, and Jasmine wiped silent tears in a room no one could see, something larger than applause pulsed through the collective heart of every witness. It was not the end of a speech, not the peak of a viral moment. It was the quiet aftershock of truth finally being spoken, not in protest, but in purpose. And as the screen faded to black and names rolled in digital silence, the lesson remained. Not in the headlines, but in the ache it left behind. Because stories like this don't end. They echo. They settle in the blood. They change the way we breathe. What this moment taught, what it seared into the bones of everyone who saw it, is that injustice doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers through rules. Sometimes it hides behind silence. Sometimes it looks like a locked door, a raised eyebrow, a mic turned off, a name that no one says out loud. For Ilhan, injustice wasn't always someone shouting her down. It was rooms full of allies going quiet when the fire reached her. For Jasmine, it wasn't the threats that hurt the most. It was the fact that her courage nearly cost her everything. And still, no one came to stand beside her until she screamed alone for 6 hours in the dark. The human lesson is not that courage is loud or clean or triumphant. The lesson is that courage often hurts. It isolates. It humiliates. It strips you bare in public and dares you to keep standing. This story revealed that we have mistaken silence for neutrality and composure for strength. But what Jasmine and Ilhan did, what they showed the world in those stolen, unscripted moments, was that the most powerful act of defiance is simply choosing to remain whole in a world that keeps trying to break you into parts. And there is another lesson, quieter but just as vital. That empathy is not a performance. It's not retweeting a quote or nodding during a panel. It's the risk of recognition. It's looking at someone else's bruises and saying, I have those too, even when the room isn't safe, especially when the room isn't safe. Because when Ilhan turned away and cried, and when Jasmine didn't flinch but simply reached out with her eyes and her silence, what they gave us wasn't a moment of weakness. It was a blueprint for survival, for dignity, for not letting pain calcify into bitterness, but instead letting it become fuel for something real. They taught us that real representation isn't about perfection. It's about proximity. Proximity to pain, proximity to risk. It's not about climbing high enough to avoid the storm. It's about standing in the rain long enough to call it out by name so someone else doesn't drown thinking they're alone. Jasmine didn't become a symbol because she stood at a podium. She became one because she stayed on the sidewalk, in the heat, under the weight of a system designed to outlast her. Ilhan didn't break the silence because she cried. She broke it because she let the world see her cry and still didn't run from the light. The human truth is this: fear is not a flaw. It is a signal that what you're doing matters, that the risk is real, that the cost is not performative. And so when Jasmine said, I was afraid, but if I didn't stand there, who would be next to be swallowed by silence? She wasn't just recounting a night in Dallas. She was naming a question that lives inside every person who's ever wondered if their pain was worth the noise it would make. And Ilhan, when she said, you reminded me why I came here in the first place, she wasn't just thanking Jasmine. She was admitting something raw, that even warriors forget, that even icons falter, that even those who carry the burden of change sometimes forget why they started and need someone else, someone with a voice still trembling, to remind them that purpose is not forged in clarity, but in chaos, that we do not need to be unshakable to speak. We just need to speak even when we shake, especially when we shake. And that is the final, most dangerous truth this story offers. That shaking is not the symptom of weakness, it is the proof of presence. It is the sound of someone daring to stay, even when everything in them wants to run. And when we speak while shaking, when we stand with our knees buckling and our voices cracking, we break something. Not ourselves, the silence, the illusion, the machinery that depends on our stillness to keep turning. So here is the lesson, stitched in blood and truth. You don't need to roar to be powerful. You need to be honest. You don't need to be fearless. You need to be willing. Willing to speak when it costs you. Willing to tremble in public. Willing to be the first voice that dares say, this is not okay. This is not over. This is not the best we can do. The world will not hand you safety, but you can hand someone else their courage. And that, more than any policy, more than any title, more than any victory lap, is how change begins. Not with perfection, but with one voice, shaking, still speaking, and someone else finally listening. And if that was the lesson, if the silence was shattered, the tear was seen, the truth was finally spoken, then here comes the question that can no longer be avoided. What will you do with what you've just witnessed? Because moments like this do not come wrapped in applause. They do not leave behind trophies or tidy headlines. They leave behind responsibility. They leave behind weight. And if you felt that weight pressed down on your chest as Jasmine stood alone in the Texas heat, if you felt your throat close as Ilhan's voice cracked and she spoke anyway, then understand this. You are no longer a spectator. You are implicated. You are chosen. You are called. Because silence is not neutral. Silence is not safety. Silence is complicity stitched in professional tone and polite avoidance. The world is burning behind closed doors, and far too many have mistaken inaction for wisdom. But not you. Not anymore. Because now you know that a single act of courage can rewrite the rules of what we accept and what we refuse to let happen again. So don't you dare return to your timeline and scroll past this moment like it was content. This was not content. This was a rupture in the machine, a crack in the illusion that power only belongs to those with platforms, cameras, and titles. Jasmine wasn't famous when she stood for 6 hours. Ilhan wasn't protected when she cried on live television. They didn't move the world because they were untouchable. They moved it because they let themselves be touched by the fire and chose not to flinch. The question is, will you? Will you raise your hand in that meeting and say what no one else will? Will you write the post that may cost you likes but save someone's dignity? Will you pull someone aside when others look away? Will you refuse the promotion that asks for your silence as payment? Will you protect the next Jasmine before she's left alone on the curb? Will you catch the next Ilhan before the silence swallows her whole? Because if not you, then who? Do not let the elegance of these women fool you into thinking their path was paved in support. Their path was littered with landmines, legal threats, racist headlines, anonymous voicemails, and the silent betrayal of people who knew better but chose quiet. Every time Jasmine live-streamed, she didn't know if she'd make it home. Every time Ilhan raised her voice in Congress, she risked being stripped not just of her seat, but of her humanity. They did not act because it was safe. They acted because they could not live with themselves if they didn't. That's what courage is. Not the absence of fear, not the shine of confidence, but the refusal to let fear dictate your voice. The stubborn decision to show up shaking and still speak. And now that decision is yours. This is not just about protest. This is about presence. This is not just about resistance. This is about refusal to disappear. This is not just about admiring bravery. This is about becoming the next link in the chain. The system only survives when people keep saying, "It's not my place." It crumbles when people like you decide, "This is exactly where I belong." So make no mistake, the revolution won't come from the top down. It will come from the bottom up, from the break rooms, from the classrooms, from the family dinners where silence used to win, from the student council meetings, from the people who stop asking, when will they change things, and when start saying, we are they. You don't need permission. You don't need to be polished. You don't need to be fearless. You just need to be present, fully, unapologetically. And if your voice shakes, good, let it. Because that is when the world listens. That is when people feel less alone. That is when lies lose their footing. That is when power feels threatened. That is when truth takes root. So here's what you do. You write the story that hasn't been told. You speak the line that has lived too long in your throat. You sit beside someone the world wants to erase. And you do not leave when it gets uncomfortable. You interrupt. You intervene. You insist. You don't let a coworker get mocked because of their accent. You don't let a woman be silenced in a meeting because her tone makes people uneasy. You don't let another human being bleed out in the middle of a system that demands their silence as payment for survival. You fight, not because you are without fear. You fight because fear has no claim over your conscience anymore. And if you don't know where to start here. Call someone out with compassion. Step in, even when the issue isn't yours. Ask better questions. Protect the space for truth, even if it costs you approval. Send the message. File the complaint. Raise your voice, even if it breaks. And when someone turns to you and says, "Aren't you afraid?" Say what Jasmine said. Say it with your whole shaking chest. Of course I'm afraid. But if I don't stand here, who will be next to be swallowed by silence? Because now you know what that silence costs. You saw it in Ilhan's tear. You heard it in Jasmine's voice. You felt it in your chest. So don't deny it. Don't waste it. Don't wait. You've seen what happens when one woman dares to speak in the heat. You've seen what happens when another dares to weep under lights. Now show us what happens when you answer the call. Not later. Not when you're ready. Not when the stakes are lower. Now because someone is watching. Someone whose life may change not because of a law, but because of a look, a line, a choice you make today. So make it count. Be the interruption. Be the disruption. Be the one who speaks when their voice shakes. That's when it matters most. That's when it begins. That's when you become impossible to ignore. And if your heart is still beating a little faster, good. Hold on to that. That pulse, that pressure in your chest, that's not adrenaline. That's awareness. It's the body remembering what it means to be awake, not just politically, not just socially, but morally. It's the sound of your conscience standing up inside you. Don't quiet it. Don't smother it beneath the comfort of distraction or the numbness of normalcy. Because the world is counting on your apathy. The system is betting that this fire inside you will cool by morning. Don't let it. Let this be the moment you stop waiting for someone else to be first. Let this be the day you stop editing your truth to make others comfortable. The truth is already sharp. It doesn't need your hesitation. It needs your voice. Loud, cracked, trembling, defiant. If you're not shaking, you're not close enough to what matters. So lean in. Say the hard thing. Hold the line when the room turns quiet. Don't let people joke away what breaks your heart. Don't let them twist courage into conflict or honesty into disruption. Disrupt anyway, because silence doesn't protect you. It erases you. And when they call you difficult, call yourself necessary. When they call you angry, say thank you. When they say your standards are too high, tell them the floor is what's killing people. You are not too much. You are not too loud. You are right on time. And the world needs your imperfection more than it needs your performance. Because what Jasmine did, what Ilhan carried, what every woman who has ever dared to speak truth to power has taught us, is that change does not come gently. It breaks. It cracks. It shatters glass so someone else can see through it. So be the one who speaks. Be the one who stays. Be the one who doesn't leave the table just because the conversation turns sharp. Let your voice be the one someone else remembers when they're standing on their own street, under their own streetlight, with no one watching but the world that pretends not to see. And when that moment comes, and it will come, remember this. You don't need to be fearless. You need to be faithful to truth, to justice, to the trembling inside you. Because that tremble, that's the sound of history making room, and it's calling your name. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.